Hey coders, how's it going? Mohamedou here, back again. And throughout this lesson, we'll be learning about functions. By definition, the word function is synonymous with the following words: purpose, task, job, and reason. A function typically has a single purpose and a single job to do. Functions may require input to perform their task, and they may return data or output after they have finished executing their task. It's important to note that not all functions require input and not all functions return data or output. So let's look at the real world for some examples on functions. Let's look at a blender. A blender has a purpose and a job to do: blend food. You put food inside and it blends them together and it gives you your food blended up. A blender is essentially a function. We can give our blender a name such as blend food. Whenever we want to blend food, we can simply call the blend food function and it will blend all of our food and give us the blended result. Essentially, a blender takes in input and it returns output. The next example is a cooking recipe. So imagine we have a cooking recipe that describes the steps to bake a cake. The recipe is like a function. We can give the recipe a name, such as bake cake. Whenever we want to bake a cake, we simply call the bake cake function, and it will automatically execute all the steps in the recipe, giving us a delicious cake as the result. Our last example is a calculator. So let's think about a calculator. We know that it performs mathematical operations on numbers and typically displays the result to you. In this case, you can define functions like add, subtract, even multiply and division, or even more complex operations. Each function takes in two or more numbers as input, performs the respective operation, and displays the result. For example, we can call the add function, give it the numbers 3 and 5, it'll add up 3 and 5, and then it will display to you 8 as the result. Now, if a function does not return something tangible that can be used later, we do not consider that function as a function that returns output. Therefore, a calculator takes an input, but it does not return output. And we can contrast that with the blender. When the blender is done blending food, it gives us back something tangible, and that is our blended food. And that's why we say a blender returns output. A calculator, on the other hand, doesn't give you back anything tangible. It only displays the result to you. So similar to the real world, Python also has functions. In fact, Python comes pre-packaged with many built-in functions that we can use in the code that we write. We will explore some of these Python built-in functions, learn about how they work, and how we can use them. So buckle up, and throughout the next few videos, we will dive deeper into some of these built-in functions and understand how we can use them in our code. I'll see you all in the next few videos. Python comes pre-packaged with many built-in functions that we can use in the code that we write. Similarly to the real world, functions in Python may or may not take an input. They will execute their task, and a result may or may not be returned. Inputs to functions are typically referred to as arguments. Functions in Python may require arguments, may accept optional arguments, or may not accept arguments at all. In order to call a function, you must first specify the name of the function, followed by an open parentheses, followed by any arguments, if any, to the function, with each argument separated by a comma, followed by a closed parentheses. So let's look at the example syntax on how we can call a built-in function in Python. First, we'll have the function name. We have an open parentheses, and then we can specify any arguments. So we can say argument 1, argument 2. And if there are more than 2 arguments to the function, we would separate the remaining arguments by a comma. And in the case for a function that does not take in any arguments, we would have the function name and the open and close parentheses with nothing inside. In the upcoming videos in this lesson, we will look at some popular built-in functions in Python, understand how they work, and how we can use them in our code. The print function in Python is used to display output on the console or terminal. So if we look over here to the right, This is what we call the terminal, or sometimes referred to as the console. Whenever we use the print function, output shows up here. The print function can take 0 or more arguments, and it allows you to print different data, such as text, booleans, integers, floats, lists, and even expressions. This function does not return any data. The print function is a built-in function, and it is widely used for displaying information. So let's see the print function in action and see how we can use it. So first we start off with the name of the function, which is called print, and we have open and close parentheses. And we can decide to pass arguments to the print function, but since we know the print function can take 0 or more, let's first start off by passing in no arguments. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. So as you can see, we get an empty line. So by default, if you don't pass in any arguments to the print function, it will print out an empty line. Next, let's go ahead and print out some more things. So first we'll print out some integers. So we have 10, 14, 1000. And let's go ahead and print this out. And as you can see, we see 10, 14, and 1000. Next, let's print out some booleans. So print true, and we'll print false. And let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we see true and false. Next, let's print out the none type. And as you can see, we see none here in the output. Next, let's print some strings out. So we'll say hello world, and we'll create another string that says, we are learning about the print function. Let's go ahead and print this out. So as you can see, we can see both of our strings here, hello world, and we are learning about the print function. And you may have noticed that when we print out strings in Python, in the terminal, we only see the text. So the quotes are not shown in the output. The text is only shown as is. Let's go ahead and print out some lists. So we'll have an empty list, and we'll go ahead and print this out. And as you can see, we have our empty list. Next, let's create another list that has items inside, and we'll go ahead and print this out as well. So we can have a boolean, a float, a string. We can even have another list inside, or we can have an integer. So let's go ahead and print this out. And as you can see our list. So anything that we pass into the print function will show up here in the output. We can also create a multi-line string and print that out as well. This is a multi-line string. And let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see our multi-line string printed to the output, and it spans multiple lines. So we know the print function can also take expressions. And expressions are evaluated first, and then they get printed to the terminal. So let's see this in action. So first we'll have 1 plus 2, and we'll go ahead and run this. And as you can see, I have 3. So 1 plus 2 is evaluated first, the result is 3, and then 3 gets printed to the console. One thing that I like to do when I'm using print is sometimes I like to have a nice readable message next to the value that I'm getting ready to print, just so it's easier for me to see what it is that I'm printing and how I got that value. So for example, I'm printing 1 plus 2, but in the output, I see 3. So it may not be very clear to me how I got 3. So what I may do is I'll do 1 plus 2. And I'll go ahead and I'll run this again. And now you can see 1 plus 2. And to make this even more clear, I can even add an equal sign. So now when I run this, I can see 1 plus 2 is equal to 3. So this is an example of the print function taking in more than one argument. Each argument is separated by a comma. We can even pass in multiple arguments to print. It doesn't have to just be 2. It can be 3, 4, and as many as you like. So I'll pass in 1. I'll pass in a string. I'll pass in a Boolean. I'll pass in an empty list. And I'll pass in a float. Let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we can see all of the arguments that we passed to the print function. We have 1, hello, true, the empty list, and 3.9. Next, let's do some string concatenation and print that out to the console. So we can do hello plus world. We can run this and we can see hello world. So we could also do print and we can do some string concatenation. So we'll do hello, we'll add a space, and then we'll add world at the end. And let's go ahead and print this out. And as you can see in the output, we get hello, space, and then world. Just as we see here. We have hello, we add a space, and then we add world. So string concatenation is going to produce a new string, and then we print that new string to the output. Alternatively, we could also pass in multiple arguments to the print function, and print will go ahead and print out each of those arguments separated by a space. So let's print hello, and then let's print world. So in this situation here, print is going to print 2 different arguments separated by a space, because by default, each argument that you pass to the print function will be printed to the terminal, each separated by a space. So we go ahead and run this. You can see we have the exact same output. So the difference really is here on line 37, after string concatenation is done and we get a new string, we're printing out that one string. So there's only one argument that's being passed to the print function on line 37. However, on line 38, we're printing out 2 different arguments. So we're printing out 2 things. And by default, when we print out multiple arguments, each argument is separated by a space. So that ends up resulting in us getting very similar outputs. We can also pass in different kinds of types to print. So we can pass in multiple arguments, and each argument does not have to be the same type. So we can pass in integer as the first argument. The second argument could be a list that contains the numbers 1 through 4. The third argument could be a Boolean. The fourth argument could be the none type. The fifth argument could be a string. And the last argument could be a float. So let's go ahead and run this. And you'll see here, we see all of the arguments printed to the console, with each argument being separated by a space. So let's create a few more expressions. I'll create an expression with the string hello multiplied by 3. Let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we get hello 3 times. Next, I'll create another expression. This will have the string hello multiplied by 3. And then I'll add the string world. So here we should expect to see hello 3 times, since we are multiplying it by 3. And then we should expect to have world added to the end. So let's go ahead and run this. So as you can see, we have hello, hello, hello. And then we have world. Next, let's have a list that has the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And let's go ahead and multiply this by 2. Let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we see 1, 2, 3. And then we see 1, 2, 3 again. And that's because we multiplied this by 2. So if we were to multiply this by 4, we should expect to see that 4 times. So let's go ahead and add that, and let's run this again. And as expected, we see 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We see it a total of 4 times because we multiplied it by 4. So I'm sure by now you've seen the power of the print function. It's a very useful function, and there are a lot of things that you can do with it. As we've seen, we can pass in no arguments, we can pass in more than one argument, and we can print out many of the different types that we've learned about so far. So that essentially wraps up the print function. The type function in Python is used to determine the type of a particular object. This function requires at least one input and always returns output. The required input can be any kind of object. The type function can be useful when you need to ensure that a particular object is of a specific type before performing certain operations on it. So we know that some of the types that exist in Python include ints, floats, bools, strs, and lists. So we can call the type function and pass in any one of these kinds of objects into it. So let's see this in action. So first we want to put the name of the function, which is called type, and then we can pass in input. So we can pass in, for example, the number 10. And because the type function always returns output, we can call the print function on the output. So essentially, after type is called, it gives us back data, and whatever that data we get back, the print function is going to go ahead and output that to the terminal. So let's go ahead and run that and see what we get. So as you can see, we get class int because the number 10 is an int. Let's go ahead and see another example. So we'll go ahead and call the type function, and we'll put 10 point. Let's go ahead and run this, and we see we have a float. And to make this even more clear, I'll go ahead and add a string before printing this out, and I'll say, what is the type of 10? And similarly, I'll add another string here, and I'll say, what is the type of 10 point? Let's go ahead and run this again. And as you can see, we see what is the type of 10, and we see class int, and we see here, what is the type of 10 point? Class float. So let's go ahead and call type on a few other kinds of objects. So here we'll do what is the type of, and we'll have an empty list, and we'll do type, and we'll pass in the empty list. Let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, what is the type of an empty list? We see that it's class list. Let's go ahead and call print again, and we'll say, what is the type of, and this time we'll have a list, and we'll say 1, 2, 3, and we'll add a Boolean at the end. And then we'll go ahead and call the type function, and we'll pass in the list that has 1, 2, 3, and a Boolean. So this here is just a string that is getting outputted to the terminal. And then we're going ahead and calling the type function, making a list, putting the values. Let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, what is the type of, here we have a list of the values 1, 2, 3, and true. And we see that that is a list. Let's go ahead and have a few more examples. So say, what is the type of true? Let's go ahead and get that printed out. And let's go ahead and run this. And we'll see that that is a Boolean or bool. Let's do, what is the type of none? Let's go ahead and call the type function, pass in none. And when we run that, we see none type. Next, let's see what the type is by passing in a string. So what is the type of hello? and we'll pass in the string hello to the type function. Let's go ahead and run this, and we see that the type of hello is a string. Next, let's find out the type of a multi-line string in Python. So I'll go ahead and call the type function. I'll create a multi-line string, and our text will say this is a multi-line string. Let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, the type is a string. Next, we'll create another multi-line string, but this time we'll create the string using a pair of triple single quotes. And this message will say something similar. This is another multi-line string. Let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, this is also a string. So I'm sure by now you can see the benefits of using the type function. It's extremely useful, especially in situations where you're writing a lot of code and you're not sure the types of data that you're working with. So before performing certain operations on those data, the type function can help you understand what kind of data you're dealing with. So that essentially concludes the type function. The length function in Python allows you to determine the length of a sequence, such as a list or a string. The length function takes a single required argument, and its return value is the length of the given sequence. So let's see the length function in action. For example, we can call the length function and pass in a string. We can say, hello, how are you doing today? Exclamation mark. We can also call the length function and pass in a list. And this list can contain a number, a Boolean, a string, and even another list. Now, we know that just by looking at this list, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 items. Now, it's possible that you could have a list of thousands of items, and having to count each item in the list could be extremely tedious. So in a situation like that, using the length function is very beneficial, and it will allow you to get the result immediately. Now, when we call the length function and pass in a string, anything that's enclosed in the quotes will be included in the count. So that includes spaces, punctuation, and even numbers. Now, we know that when calling the length function, it returns back data. So we can actually call the print function on whatever the length function returns back to us. So let's see what this will look like. And I'll pass in, hello, how are you doing today? So basically, the length function gets called first, and whatever it results to, that gets passed into the print function, and then the print function outputs that to the terminal. So let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we get 31. So what that means is that enclosed inside of these quotes, there are 31 characters. Next, let's call the print function, and we'll call the length function inside. And we'll get the length of a list that contains 7 integers. So we'll have the numbers 1 through 7. Let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see, we get 7. So length is very useful. Even with a large string or a large list, instead of having to count how many characters or how many items exist in the sequence, we can call the length function and get that result instantly. So that essentially wraps up the length function.